Here in just literally the last few hours, and in some cases minutes, we have continued statements by the president of Russia, by leaders in the United States, by leaders in Europe, and even in Ukraine, all trying to talk about the same thing. How can this war be brought to an end between Russia and Ukraine? And unfortunately, after now closing in on 4 years of fighting, the differences seem to be remarkably stark between the two sides. And who knows how this is going to be brought to an end, because we continue to have pressure on the front lines. That hasn't changed. That's maybe the one consistent here. But what we want to focus on in today's episode is, what does this look like from the Ukrainian side? How are they responding? We've seen a lot of the comments that are made by Zelensky and some of the other officials, but what's really going on behind the scenes, and what do the people in Ukraine think? And we have an incredible opportunity today. We have back with us Jennifer Kavanagh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, one of my colleagues there. And you just got back from Ukraine, and you had some pretty remarkable conversations. And I just want to kind of tell everybody, really at the start of this, we're not taking anybody's side in any of this. What we're doing is conducting analysis of, here's what the Ukraine side said, here's what the Russian side is saying, here's how we assess things. But we're not taking anybody's side, pro or con. We're just reporting, here's what people are saying, in some cases behind the scenes, which is really important to know. And so with that caveat, Jennifer, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And listen, I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what the nature of your visit was. I mean, did you just go on kind of a tourist visa and just happen to talk to somebody on the street, or were you invited there? How did that work out?
No, a Ukrainian think tank invited me and a few other people from DC to come and have meetings, just to get a better sense of the Ukrainian perspective on this issue, and to bring insights from Washington and how the conflict is being seen here. And so that's what we did.
And I wonder to what extent either you're aware or you suspect that anytime somebody brings, and I've seen some of these, I've been involved with some in my career, where you're brought in by a certain party to anything, and they have a very specific agenda that they want to convey something to go through, as opposed to look, we're privately just telling you the truth. This is what we actually think. Here's the pros and cons of whatever. How much of this did you perceive anyway was someone trying to send a message through you back to the United States? And how much do you think that they're just saying, no, really, this is what we think?
Well, we met with people with a wide diversity of views and heard conflicting opinions on almost every issue. So, everyone has a bias. Everyone comes with a message. That's true of me. It's true of you. It's true of everyone. And so I think it's incumbent on researchers to recognize that when you're talking to anyone, they have the message they want to send. But I will say that over the course of the week that I was there, I met with people with very wide-ranging views. And so, my insights from the trip try to synthesize those views. What did I hear most often? What was most convincing to me? Things like that.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the things that I think makes this a really valuable trip. If you had only gotten one viewpoint and everybody you talked to was singing the same sheet of music, that would imply one thing. But the fact that you got a lot of diversity of opinion, I think that means you got a really good shot at seeing the ground truth about what people think. Whether it's right or wrong is not even relevant, but the fact that this is what people are thinking about, I think, is very relevant and very important. And I want to kind of set the stage for why I think this is so important. Marco Rubio talked to the press here literally just minutes ago, just right before we came on the air here. And one of the things he talked about has direct relevance to trying to get this war over. Here's what he said.
What we're trying to figure out here is, what can Ukraine live with and what can Russia live with? Sort of identify what both sides' positions are and see if we can sort of drive them towards each other to some agreement. Wars end generally in one of two ways. Surrender by one side for another, or a negotiated settlement. We don't see surrender anytime in the near future by either side, and so only a negotiated settlement gives us the opportunity to end this war. A negotiated settlement requires two things: both sides to get something out of it, and both sides to give something. And we're trying to figure out, what can Russia give and what do they expect to get? What can Ukraine give and what can Ukraine expect to get? In the end, the decision will be up to Ukraine and up to Russia. It will not be up to the United States. And obviously the hardest issues are always the last issues.
Yeah, and certainly from study, definitely the last issues are really the hardest. You may have seen earlier this week, a lot of news reports were coming out, both from Russia and from the United States and Europe, that we were 90% of the way there. We had 90% agreement on the big issues here, but that 10%, kind of hard. I wonder what you heard. Let's just start with that one right there about this whole we're 90% of the way there. Did you get the sense that the Ukraine side felt they were nearly there?
Not really. I mean, I think that there is optimism that this round of talks is different than the others. Like we've had many since Trump came in, we've had many rounds of flurries of diplomatic activity and then sort of nothing. And I think there was optimism among those who are closely tied to the negotiations or, one step removed, that this was different, that the pace was more consistent, that the meetings were more frequent, that the conversations were more substantive. And so there's optimism that this is moving in the right direction. But the idea that this would be over soon, by the end of the year, for example, no one really believed that. And there's still a deep skepticism outside of the political establishment that Russia's really serious about peace. And I mean, I guess I tend to agree with this assessment that we may be entering the end game, but we're not 90% of the way there. I mean, the set of issues that are still unresolved to me is quite extensive, and they are the hardest. And I actually disagree a little bit with Rubio's statement that ultimately the U.S. is sort of outside of this. I mean, there are issues that are between Ukraine and Russia, but there are also issues between the United States and Russia. And so thinking about the U.S. here as a mediator only is, I think, the wrong frame. The U.S. is a party to these negotiations because there are some things that Russia wants, like commitments on Ukraine's NATO membership, commitments on NATO expansion, a discussion of Europe's security architecture. These are things Ukraine can't give.
And you mentioned that about territory. I mean, that's one of the biggest. I'm going to come back to that headline Gary was showing there in a second. So Gary, if you kind of keep that handy. But one of the things you talked about in some of your notes that you had from your visit here, which I'm going to read a little bit from, which I thought was really helpful, is that you say public opinion in Ukraine generally favors negotiations over continuing to fight, but attitudes depend heavily on conditions for peace. On territory, there is no appetite for withdrawing or ceding territory to Russia unconditionally, unilaterally, and there is no political space for de jure recognition. Now, territory is one of the key issues here that the Russians are asking for. And said, I believe it was Sergei Ryabkov on ABC News on Monday, said, yeah, there is no room for negotiations on the all four of the oblasts that they annexed in 2022 to include Kherson and Zaporizhia, which some had suggested, well, maybe they can just take the current line of contact and just you get what you got. But now they're saying, no, there's no compromise on any of that. If the Ukraine side is also not willing to compromise on that, where do we go?
I think the big question here is what happens to the rest of Donetsk. I think that freezing along the line of contact would probably be okay in Zaporizhia and Kherson. But the question here is what happens to the rest of Donetsk, because the Russian side has been pretty clear that they will need full control of that territory, and the Ukrainians are not willing to cede it unilaterally. Now, there is this other idea that's been floated about turning that territory into a demilitarized zone. The Russians have indicated some openness to that idea, but the way the Ukrainians and the Russians talk about this demilitarized zone are very different. On the Ukrainian side, the idea is that Ukraine might withdraw, and let's say they withdraw 20, 30 kilometers, then Russia would withdraw the same amount, and that territory in the middle would become the demilitarized zone, but it would come from both sides withdrawing. And that territory would then be monitored by an international force made up of, say, Indonesian soldiers or Indian soldiers. There are a lot of questions about that. For example, how are the cities and towns provided security? Who collects the taxes? What property codes and legal codes prevail? So there's lots of problems with that. But on the Russian side, the idea that they would withdraw at all is a non-starter. So maybe that territory becomes a demilitarized zone, but it's only Ukraine that withdraws. And Putin's foreign policy advisor, Ushakov, has suggested that, well, there might not be Russian soldiers, but there might be Russian National Guard personnel, portraying these National Guard personnel as more law enforcement. But that's a very different model of the demilitarized zone idea than Ukraine has. So I do think the territory question is a very complicated and challenging one. My sense right now is that there's just no political space for ceding this territory unilaterally. Zelensky could agree to it in principle, but the parliament would never pass it. The public would never accept it. I'm not even sure the military personnel who are in that territory would withdraw from their positions. Instead, I see actually the potential for really widespread protests and even instability in the country. So to me right now, it's just a political impossibility.
Well, I want to go down this path here. You said on the whole the demilitarized zone issue here, because there are three really different interpretations and visions for this. You just mentioned some of them. On let's see, I think it was also on Monday. You had the Russian ambassador saying that, listen, the deputy foreign minister, Ryabkov said, listen, on terms of this, we would only accept a independent parties. You mentioned maybe some other countries, not NATO. He expressly said no NATO country, period, under any circumstance would be allowed in there. Or, as we actually had the deputy UN ambassador for Russia on our show yesterday, said we would literally consider them as combatants and they would be attacked. So pretty stark on that. Meanwhile, you had Mark Rutte, I guess day before yesterday, said that, yeah, and we think that it should be this coalition of the willing. So on the European side, they're saying, yeah, it should be European people. On the Russian side, said, no, it shouldn't be any European soldiers. What do the Ukraine side say on what do they think?
Well, I mean, in terms of the demilitarized zone, they want an international force. They recognize that they're not going to be European forces. They don't want them to be Chinese forces either. They want sort of neutral parties, which is why I mentioned countries like India or Indonesia, maybe the Gulf states. But there's a question of whether those forces would be willing to do that. So, I don't know the answer. The broader question about post-war Ukraine security and whether or not European forces could be based inside Ukraine as part of this sort of reassurance force. I think some people in Ukraine still talk about this as something that could be a layer of their security. Those who do suggest that it only works if Europe puts its forces not in Lviv, but somewhere close to the front line, which I don't see any interest in Europe in doing. But most people are very skeptical. They say things like, well, the coalition of the willing doesn't exist. They don't actually have any faith that Europe will be able to raise a military force or will be willing to deploy it. And in reality, that's rational. If the United States or Europe, inside or outside of NATO, thought that fighting for Ukraine was worth it, they would be doing it now. And they are not, right? They're not. So why should we expect that in the future they would put themselves in harm's way to do it?
So let me ask you a question on that, because that's something that's been said for a lot of time. It's something I observed literally earlier this week. You've been traveling around, not just in Ukraine, but you've also been traveling around recently in Europe. How do the Europeans address that claim that they would deploy this stuff when there doesn't seem to be any evidence that they either can or would, because they couldn't even afford it if they could muster it? How do they justify these mutually exclusive statements?
Well, they don't have a good answer. The only answer I've heard is that it's different now because they understand the threat that Russia poses. And they understand that Russia is now an existential threat to their security. And they didn't understand this in 2022. But then my question is, okay, it's 2022 was, we're almost 4 years out from the start of the war. So if you've now realized that Russia is an existential threat, where's the military spending? Where's the military buildup? I know they're doing some rearming, but it's kind of underwhelming. And why haven't you deployed forces into Ukraine in the past 4 years? And they haven't. So to me, they don't really have an answer for this. And I think ultimately it's simply not realistic for the simple reason that why would Russia fight for 4 years to avoid Ukraine's military integration into the West, and then accept terms of settlement that allow for exactly that outcome when they're winning on the battlefield? It makes no sense.
Yeah, it doesn't. And there's a lot of that doesn't make any sense. In terms of something else that it doesn't seem to make sense, one of the other things you wrote about here is you said there is also a belief that in the medium term, Ukraine believes that it can likely meet its own defense needs, with the exception of air defense, combat aircraft, and long-range missiles. And that by itself is a pretty big caveat. And I don't know how you can provide for your own security needs if you can't meet those absolutely profound categories. How do they acknowledge that?
Well, so I think here we're talking about post-war. Okay, so like when the war ends, how will Ukraine arm its military for future security? And so I've argued that an armed on alignment model is the most feasible outcome for Ukraine's military. That would mean it's outside of military alliances, but it would have a military that is capable of defending itself were aggression to resume without direct Western intervention. Now, I do think that some forms of Western security assistance would continue, maybe not in terms of all military capabilities. But then the question becomes, where does the bulk of Ukraine's defense material come from? I think it is important that Ukraine can produce almost all of what it needs by itself if it gets enough financing. It can produce its own artillery, it can produce its own drones, it can produce its own armored vehicles, it can even produce a lot of munitions. Where it still needs help from the West is in munitions, just getting enough of them, and that may actually diminish over time their dependence on the West. Right now, they don't have substitute for air defense, so they will need Western assistance for air defense. But I guess I don't see that as being out of the question. I think that the United States and Europe would be willing to provide Ukraine with some amount of air defense in a post-war context to help make sure that war doesn't resume. That's in everyone's interest. And then combat aircraft and long-range missiles. I mean, my view is that Ukraine actually doesn't need more of these. They have enough combat aircraft, in my view, now to serve in an air defense role. It's about 100 aircraft. That should be enough to patrol their skies. And long-range missiles, this is something that Ukraine believes is vital to its security. I sort of disagree. Long-range strike capabilities are useful on the margins for a defensive strategy, but they're not essential. And Ukraine does have its own long-range missile production capacity, which I wouldn't suggest putting caps on. The problem is that these missiles aren't that precise, so they are just much less effective right now than Western missiles. So I guess I, too, am quite optimistic that in the medium term, Ukraine can meet most of its defense needs. And with some Western assistance, which I see to be politically and economically feasible in a post-war context for a limited period of time, it should have the ability to build stockpiles sufficient to deter future aggression.
So that would be, and just to clarify, I understood correctly, all those things you just described would be in a post-war situation after something had been agreed to. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean,
not now.
Yeah, I mean, right now, it's difficult for Ukraine to meet its defense needs because it's burning through material so fast, and it just needs more time to build up its defense industrial base. But yeah, that comment is mostly about the post-war context. In the near term, they continue to need significant Western assistance. I still don't think they need more long-range missiles or combat aircraft, but they definitely need more air defense.
Yeah. I think it's a definite clear statement there. Getting to that post-war, though, is obviously the big kicker and one of the big issues that has to be resolved between the sides. And one thing Rubio was right about is that in order to get to an agreement, both sides eventually have to agree to whatever the terms are. And one of the key sticking points there is on these security guarantees, about which you wrote from Ukraine. There is a strong preference for something that can be codified and made legally binding with legislative endorsement, even if this necessitates a narrower set of external commitments. For example, commitments of regular post-war peacetime military assistance with options for a surge in case of renewed fighting passed through Congress are seen as generally preferable to an executive agreement that promises Article 5-like commitments on the Qatar model. But do you think that there is literally any chance in God's earth that the United States Congress would literally pass some kind of legally binding security arrangements for the country of Ukraine against Russia?
Well, it depends what we're talking about in terms of security arrangement. Do I think that Congress will pass an Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine? No. Do I think that Congress might pass 5 years of military assistance to Ukraine as part of a post-war package? I think so. I mean, Congress is actually quite hawkish, and there's a significant support to Ukraine. I think that in a post-war context, some kind of arrangement that provided Ukraine with some limited amount of military assistance for, say, 5 years is something that could pass through Congress. I also think that there would be an appetite for making a commitment like, if Russia attacks again, we will provide you more military assistance, which would just be a commitment to do what we've already done for the past 4 years. Now, you and I don't like that, right? We would say, like, we should just stay out of it next time. But do I think that that type of commitment could get through Congress? Yeah. And the creation of strategic stockpiles, I actually think is probably a good idea. Now, I wouldn't do this for the United States only. Like, Europe should be carrying the bulk of this. They should be making longer term commitments of more money and more military aid. But building strategic stockpiles of long range weapons that would be based in Poland and Romania that Ukraine could get if war were to restart, I think that's reasonable. The United States has actually done that in the past. It used to be under the Clinton administration that air defense missiles for Taiwan were stored at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. And they were stored there so they didn't provoke China, but they were available for Taiwan if a conflict started. It served as sort of a deterrent. So I do think that there are packages that could pass through Congress that would be politically feasible, economically feasible, and would not entail sort of like, I push back on this idea of the Israel model, where 50 years from now, we're still providing Ukraine $4 billion of military assistance a year. That's not what I'm talking about. But some sort of limited package, I think in a post-war context, you could get that through Congress.
Yeah, anything that sends money for weapons and stuff and keeps the defense industrial base going, I'm sure probably would not be a hard sell, at least not here. Now, as long as it's not any kind of an Article 5 type, an attack on one is an attack on us, then I think that there's some room for that. They don't need much encouragement on the money, though.
But I think the important point about the observation there is that Ukraine isn't looking for like empty commitments. They don't want like a Qatar model. We promise to defend them, but it doesn't go through Congress. Like that is less appealing to them than something narrow that does pass through Congress. And this reflects their experience of the Budapest Memorandum. They felt that this was like not honored, that these assurances were worthless. So I think this is important, just as we think, as we sit here today, having spent the whole week talking about Article 5 security guarantees for Ukraine, like they're not actually looking for that. Like they're looking for something that can go through Congress, that even if it's narrow, they want actionable things that are specific that they can count on. And I think the United States could offer them much less and pass it through Congress to get to a deal, rather than offering something that's big and expansive, has tons of risks, and actually isn't that credible.
And then again, circling back to any agreement has to be agreed to by both sides of the conflict. Do you see the prospect that the Russians would agree to that? So from a position of military strength, which I think we all can agree, certainly the Russians are on the top side of that balance of power, would they agree to something that passes through Congress like you just described?
I think so. If the other terms were sufficient. I mean, they may want limits on certain types of capabilities. Like during peacetime, they're probably going to push back on the United States providing long-range weapons or combat aircraft. But as I said before, I don't think Ukraine needs those things, and I would also push back on the U.S. giving those things to Ukraine in peacetime. So I think if you're specific about what weapons can be included, it's limited duration, whether or limited amount in terms of dollars. And I think, the creation of strategic stockpiles, I mean, they may not like it, but, unless Russia completely defeats Ukraine on the battlefield, it has not infinite leverage, and it does want a lot of things from the United States. So I think that there's room for trades. There's room to provide Russia things it wants in return for a little bit more flexibility on Ukraine. And I actually think that should be the U.S.'s role. Right?
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. In fact, that was some of the things that were said both by the Russians and the United States after this last round of Witkoff talks and after the Anchorage talk, that Russia is looking for a lot of things beyond the war. And so there is some leverage there that we can work some nuance there. Everything, like they say, the devil's in the details, but at least I think that the options are there for some kind of flexibility. We'll see. But to get to any of those kinds of an agreement, especially to acknowledge, which Putin said actually earlier this week, that he believes a negotiated settlement is possible so long as the Ukraine side recognizes the military certainty. I'm sorry, I said Putin. That was Ryabkov. He said, as long as the Ukraine side recognizes the centrality of the Russian military dominance on the ground tactically, he said, then lots of things are possible. Now, one of the things from your notes that really stood out to me was, while the urgency of reaching a deal is increasing, Ukraine is not yet desperate, nor is there an appetite for peace at any cost. Constraints on the ability to keep fighting are growing, but Ukraine does not believe it is on the verge of defeat. Manpower challenges are significant. Money and weapon limitations are a factor. There's also concern about the sustainability of civilian infrastructure if things get very cold, but the battlefield situation is viewed in Kiev as serious, but not yet as a crisis. How are they viewing that? Because from my military analysis, I think it is really dangerous, much more so than they seem to say on the ground.
Well, of course, they're going to be more optimistic maybe than you and me. There's a little bit of confirmation bias, I think. But, I think the key point is that they don't feel desperate. And I think, I think you could argue it either way. On the one hand, I agree that the manpower shortages, material shortages, and Russia's just significantly greater size and industrial capacity to throw at this problem suggest that, continuing to fight is sort of a slow suicide for Ukraine. However, at the same time, Russia's gains have been very slow. And we know that, and their costs have been very high. So, is it possible that Ukraine's lines collapse in the next 6 months and Russia makes significant territorial gains? Yes. Is it also possible that those lines hold and Russia actually makes very small gains? Also, yes. I think both are possible. We could argue which is more likely. But I think that from the Ukrainian perspective, continuing to fight is still worth it.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that one of the next things you wrote there probably leads into that. And I wonder if you could expound a little bit. You wrote, but there is little appetite for the kind of changes in Ukraine that would be necessary to fix the difficulties that they have, to include lowering the conscription age, which apparently they're against, even though many people are saying it should go down to 18. There are those who want to keep fighting, who believe that with additional support, Ukraine can fight Russia to a stalemate. Please advance on that in a second. The next sentence, though, that said, few are ready to accept capitulation. There is a belief that they will find a way, just as they have for the past 4 years. Is there any scenario that you saw anybody talking about where they say, but if this happens, then we'll see that all hope is lost? Or is that even in their thinking?
I don't think they can afford to think that way. Like it's not possible given the necessity of maintaining their morale and continuing life as in any sort of fashion. And I think you still hear people who talk about, we just need more pressure on Russia, we just need more weapons, and then we can change the trajectory of the war. But one thing I've noticed, between visits in October and more recently, is that the passion with which those arguments are made is diminishing. So I still heard them, but the people who articulated them, their heart really wasn't in it. Like they understand that that's not likely, like they can't change the trajectory. But still, going back to something that you mentioned earlier, like they're just not ready for peace on any terms. They'd rather keep fighting. And I think part of that is their just assessment of the Russian threat. There's still many people who believe that even if we get a peace deal now, Russia will come back later for more. And so there's no point in stopping, because it's not a choice between war and peace that endures. It's a choice between war now and more war later. And we might as well just keep fighting now.
And is there any concept that if you choose the latter and keep fighting now so we don't have to fight one later, that you may lose this one now? Is there any concept of that?
I mean, yeah, people recognize that's a risk, but as this idea that they'll just figure out a way, that things will just turn out okay. I mean, it's based on their experience, right? Like multiple times they've been like, we're almost out of air defense, but we'll figure it out. And then more air defense arrives. We're almost out of money, but then more money arrives. And I think even with this, the European Union just developed a way to provide Ukraine additional financing, right? Not using the Russian assets, but sort of a loan that will be financed by the EU budget. And I see, when I was there, I asked about this reparations zone. Like, what are you going to do if it doesn't happen? And for context, Ukraine depends on Europe for like 45 to 60% of its budget. So if they don't get more money from Europe, they're out of money by April. And so I asked, what's plan B if it doesn't happen? And they just there was no plan B. They just believed that it would work out. And again, it sort of did. So I think time and time again, they felt pressed against the wall and things have worked out. And they just believe that this will keep happening. Now, obviously, you and I probably agree that like eventually time is going to run out and time isn't really on their side. The last thing I'll say is that I think there are those who admit, though, that like the deal on the table now is not politically palatable. Like it's not acceptable. But they'll fight for another year and it will be the same deal on the table. Like they understand that the deal isn't going to get better, but still it's politically easier to keep fighting, to lose the territory and maybe accept the same deal in a year than it is to accept it today.
Well, that was actually the next thing I wanted to talk about, because and I wonder if you could explain to our audience how this works on the ground, because you wrote, there are limits to what Zelensky can accept and implement domestically. He will have to be able to sell any deal to the public or risk significant political upheaval domestically. For example, it will be difficult to cede territory now. De jure recognition will be impossible, you wrote. The public may accept approach that turns parts of the Donbass into a DMZ, but not unilateral withdrawal. Even if Zelensky were to accept such a withdrawal, such a deal could not be ratified by the Rada and likely would be impossible to implement. What is the situation in the country? Because it seems like they're at least closer to the fighting you get from what I've heard from others who have visited. They said the closer to the fighting, the belief of the Ukrainian people is that we need to do whatever to get this over with. And then the further you get to the West, the more likely they are to say, no, let's keep going. Have you observed that dynamic?
I mean, certainly attitudes vary, but I mean, recent polling, like of the country as a whole, suggests that 75% of the country rejects the idea of ceding the territory in Donetsk. So this is like overwhelming, right? There's very few people who want to give up that territory. And so this is what I mean. Like, I mean, there's lots of issues still unresolved, but the territory one to me is like, it's important because it's like so non-negotiable for both sides. And Zelensky could say to the US, fine, we'll give up the territory. But he can't, like, he can't get that through the Rada. It's not acceptable. The public's not going to accept it. The military might not withdraw. So it's like, it's a non-starter. You could make that commitment, but you can't deliver on it. And that to me is really dangerous. And I think that, when I got back from this trip, like I hadn't changed my mind on anything. Like I wasn't converted to like believe something that I didn't believe going over there. But I did come back with a much more nuanced understanding of the difficulty and complexity of Ukraine's political situation and the way in which that really constrains actors. So it's not an issue of moral hazard. Some people have asked me, well, are they still fighting because they believe in these like mythical US security guarantees that they're going to get? And that's not it. They don't believe in these mythical security guarantees, but they just can't. The political maneuver space is too narrow to accept this, even though everyone knows the war needs to end.
Now, that's actually very, very illuminating. And now, to what extent would you say those domestic pressures influence what Zelensky says in public? Because here he was I guess, earlier this week, talk about how he wants to pressure America into coming over to his side of this.
But I really count on pressure from the United States. Now United States more mediating, it's true they're mediating between us. But I really wanted very much them more steps pressuring Russia, because I think that Putin doesn't want to stop this war, but he can if United States will pressure more. And President Trump, he can, I think so, and God bless, he will be successful in this.
I mean, let's just look at the practicality of that. First of all, how much pressure do you think that Trump can or even wants to impose on Russia to do some of the things that Zelensky's asking for here?
Yeah, I mean, my view is that the U.S. doesn't have that much leverage here to get Putin to stop the war, and that Trump wants to use the levers that are available even less. I mean, more military assistance is sort of a non-starter. The U.S. can only produce so much. Europe is basically out of material. It's all coming from U.S. production lines, even if Europe is paying for it. So I don't see there as an option to like provide more weapons. Providing things like Tomahawks isn't going to change the trajectory of the war and has major escalation risks. So that's out. The idea of adding more sanctions, I mean, sure, we can put on more sanctions, but the sanctions impose costs, but they don't change Putin's calculus. We've seen this over and over again. And we're getting to the point where more sanctions actually could impose costs on the US economy. Like, let's say that we impose these secondary sanctions or secondary tariffs on China for buying Russian oil. Like, that hurts the US. We've already seen this. We've already run the script of like what it looks like to put 145% tariffs on China. We did that this spring and it was a disaster. So why do it? Like, this is basically the same thing, just for another reason. So now I do think that there are some points of leverage that Trump could use. And I've written about this. I think that as you and I have discussed, there are things that Putin wants from the United States, things like commitments on NATO membership and normalized ties with the United States and business deals. And I think this New START renewal, I think these are things that the United States could effectively sort of hang out there as like, we'll deal with you on these things, but you have to end this war first. And if you did it effectively, maybe you kind of push Putin to towards the end game a little faster. I actually, I do think, maybe we could talk about this later, but I do think we're coming to a point where there could be a window maybe next year to end the war. I don't think it's right now. Like, I don't have a lot of faith in like the Christmas ceasefire, but I do think we're getting towards the end game. But again, this idea that the United States has all this pressure that it could exert, I push back on that.
Now, one of the other, because there was two different aspects that Zelensky this week in separate conversations said that he wanted to put pressure on folks. One was on Trump, he just said there. The other one, though, was on Russia. And in this soundbite we'll pass here, this speech he gave, I believe, was to the Dutch parliament. He seemed to be talking more about conditions as though he were on the military dominant position instead of the ceasefire or the weaker side here. And one wonders how much what he said here was based on trying to placate a domestic policy and how much he actually thinks or actually believes what he's saying.
That's exactly where the real path to peace begins. It's not enough to force Russia into a deal. It's not enough to make it stop killing. We must make Russia accept that there are rules in the world and that it cannot deceive everyone. This is the path to lasting peace. Ladies and gentlemen, together with partners, we are working not only to stop the bloodshed, but to change the situation along Russia's borders so there is no opportunity to start another war. And we understand that criminals don't change in a day. That's why the talks these days are not only about ceasefire, but about security guarantees. This is not only about diplomacy, not only about physical security. It's also about making Russia finally learn to live by the rule of law.
Is there any belief that people inside of Kiev actually think that there is the leverage somehow as it exists right now for Ukraine to compel Russia to comply to terms that they feel are just and lasting and that will prevent a future war, etc.? Otherwise, what does that mean?
So I should be clear. I do think that there is a path to a lasting peace. I don't think it will be just. In fact, I think it will be unfair and painful for Ukraine to accept. There are still people in Ukraine who talk about upholding international law and the desire to see Russia punished, that Russia should pay, that we have to uphold the quote unquote rules-based order. These phrases kind of make me cringe. So this idea that Russia is going to be forced to see that there are rules in the world. In my view, the rules-based order is sort of a fantasy, and the rules are that power is what matters, and military power matters a lot. So I guess I see that as unlikely. And the idea that we're going to impose changes on Russia's borders so that conflict can never happen again. I don't know what that means. I think ultimately this idea that we're going to have an end to this war that punishes Russia, restores the rules-based order, upholds international law. To me, that's a fantasy. We can hope for a peace that leaves Ukraine the territory that the Ukrainian government still controls sovereign and secure for the long term. I believe that there is a way to arm Ukraine to defend itself so that it can make, not so that it can defeat a Russian invasion again, but so that it just makes another invasion so costly that Putin thinks this isn't worth it. It's not worth doing this again. And that I think is possible. And that's what the goal should be. The goal shouldn't be this kind of restoration of some mythical international law.
Yeah, and I would think that one of the things would be that Russia always talks about the root causes of this, which center around NATO in Ukraine. So if that goes off the table, then I think it's at least theoretically possible we could find something that would not lead to a future war, but that remains to be seen if it gets worked out. Listen, the last thing I wanted to ask you about today was something that Zelensky has said recently and something that Putin talked about today. And that is the prospect of a election in Ukraine. Actually, Trump is the one that raised this idea a week or so ago, said there should be an election on that Politico. You may remember that Politico interview that they did with Trump. He said, yeah, there needs to be an election. And then Zelensky shortly after that says, yeah, there can be an election. We'll do one as long as there is a ceasefire that happens around and allows an election to take place. And then today, Putin says this about an election.
They want to use the elections solely to put an end to Russia's advancement on the battlefield, then they are wrong. That said, I'm going to say something which is probably going to sound surprising. We are willing to think about how to ensure security during elections in Ukraine. Well, we could refrain from strikes in the depth of Ukrainian territory on election day. We have the right to demand that those who organize these elections should provide the right to cast their ballot to those Ukrainians who are currently residing in the territory of the Russian Federation.
So for the moment, let's not even talk about whether Russia would or wouldn't have a ceasefire for that, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say that they did. So that would seem close to saying that what Zelensky and Putin both said about an election were close. And if Russia would agree to some kind of election ceasefire, not like a long period of time, but something for elections to be held, would Ukraine actually hold presidential elections?
All right. So right now they're under martial law, and they cannot legally have elections under martial law. So they are, I believe, working on some kind of a legal change that would permit them to have elections. There's a lot of challenges. It's not just the continuation of the war that would make the voting unsafe, but how do they make sure everyone has access to ballots? What about the territories currently occupied by Russia? I think there's a question. How do you deal with the Ukrainian citizens that have left? How do you deal with the Ukrainian citizens that are living in Europe or elsewhere? So I think there's a lot of logistics to work out. I also am not sure, on the one hand, Russia has indicated that they don't want to sign a deal with Zelensky. They want to deal with someone else. And they see Zelensky as no longer legitimate because he hasn't faced elections. Some in the U.S. also believe that it would be easier to negotiate with someone else. And Zelensky has made a lot of maximalist comments, especially early in the war, about returning to 91 borders and things like that do make it difficult for him to accept now a significant compromise and sell it as a victory. In my view, it's likely that whoever signs the deal is going to be out. Like, the deal is going to be unpopular. It's going to be difficult to sell, and that's going to be the end of that person's political career. The other challenge, though, is that the candidates that would likely run against Zelensky are more hawkish than him. They are probably less desirable from the Russian perspective to have as Ukraine's leader. And that shouldn't be surprising, right? Ukraine is the people are very nationalistic. They're very anti-Russia, what's left inside of especially the part that the Ukrainian government still controls. So it's not clear to me that an election that gets someone like, Zaluzny or someone else in power is going to be all that much more favorable to Russia. I mean, they may see that leader as more legitimate, but getting a deal could be harder. So, I think some of the posturing on the Russian side about elections is really because they want Zelensky out. We know that Putin doesn't like him. And in the U.S., there's not a lot of love for Zelensky either. So I do think the question of elections is a complicated one. Ultimately, they do have to happen. Maybe they do happen during wartime, but I don't know that having them during wartime solves the problems that people have attached to the lack of elections, if that makes sense.
But it does seem that it would be, at least theoretically, something to contemplate, that if the West wanted to, and that means Europe and the United States, and they wanted to, and I know you said something about coercing an outcome is not good. You can address that in a second, but they could say, listen, you're going to have to agree to this and then hold elections. You're not going to win that elections, so we need you to take the poison pill for the team now, and then you can go somewhere and relax or retire in safety somewhere else if you want to, but somebody else is going to have to take over after this, but we need you to take the poison pill now. Do you see any possibility of that?
I think it's possible. The deal still has to be politically sellable to the public. It's important to remember that Zelensky isn't the only one who matters here. It's still probably going to have to be ratified by the Rada. It still have to be implemented. And I do think it's important that the public believes that whatever peace is signed is going to last. And I think that for a couple of reasons. I think, first of all, lots of people have left Ukraine. If they don't see the peace deal as one that's likely to last, that's going to lead to the remainder of Ukraine being sovereign and prosperous, why come back? People who are there now who haven't been able to leave will leave once martial law is lifted. So you lose more people. And what you're left with then is a population of Ukrainian nationalists that want to restart the war. And that seems to me like a bad outcome. You can't, if the country doesn't seem like it has a peaceful future, you can't get investors to go back in there. You can't have reconstruction. And so you end up with kind of the worst possible situation, a poor, struggling, nationalist Ukraine. That's just that's not a good outcome for Russia. It's not a good outcome for Europe. It's not a good outcome for the United States. So to me, like, we should be careful of thinking that the answer here is just to force Ukraine into a bad deal. Who cares? Let's walk away. I understand that. You know, I don't want the US to have long-term commitments in Ukraine either. I've been very vocal about that for a long time. But I do think that there's a limit, that we should understand that there's a limit, that an imposed surrender isn't necessarily the best outcome, even if it's the fastest.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it in those terms before. That's a very, very vital and to understand and important. We'll see how it works out, though, because unfortunately, it looks like we didn't come up with the answer today that I was hoping for. But it's
this weekend. It's going to happen this weekend in Miami. Everything's going to be solved.
Perfect. Well, great. Happy Christmas to everyone then. That'll be great. Well, we'll keep on watching that. We'll report that good news whenever it comes. But in any case, for today, we really, really appreciate you coming on and sharing these really terrific insights, because it helps us to understand a great many things about what we see on the diplomatic front anyway, and appreciate that.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me, and happy holidays and happy New Year to everyone.
Same to you. And also we appreciate you guys. And we will look forward to seeing you on the very next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.